Gavin Newsom strode onto the illuminated stage with the easy, gliding gait of a man who believed the world was already his to command, his smile fixed in that perfect, camera-ready wattage that had graced 1,000 magazine covers. But just 45 minutes later, that trademark dazzle would be extinguished, replaced by the hollow, haunted look of a politician, realizing he had brought a rehearsed speech to a street fight. Across from him, standing with the stillness of a predator waiting in the tall grass, Tulsi Gabbard prepared to dismantle not just his policies, but the very performative essence of his leadership. And the crowd, initially polite, would soon erupt with the ferocity of a breaking storm. What began as a standard political debate morphed into a visceral public dressing down that left one rising star exposed as a fraud and the other towering as the voice of a forgotten reality. Do not look away, because the systematic destruction of a political narrative that unfolded that night sent tremors through the democratic establishment that are still being felt today. The atmosphere inside the cavernous debate hall in Georgia was heavy, pressurized, almost suffocating in its intensity, as if the air itself was thick with the unsaid frustrations of millions of Americans. It wasn't merely the heat of the studio lights or the hum of the television cameras panning over the sea of faces. It was the unspoken understanding that this was not going to be a polite exchange of ideas. This was a collision of two distinct universes. On one side stood the governor of California, the golden child of the party, draped in the luxury of high office and protected by a wall of donors and friendly media outlets. On the other stood the challenger, the exile, the woman who had dared to cross the lines of her own party, carrying a reputation for slicing through talking points with the precision of a surgeon. The audience sat tight in their seats, shoulders brushing, a collective entity of anticipation. They weren't there for the sound bites. They were there for the bloodsport of truth. Viewers at home leaned forward on their couches, sensing that the carefully curated reality usually presented on the nightly news was about to be shattered. The questions burning in the minds of the people were not abstract policy debates. They were raw, bleeding wounds. Why are our streets unsafe? Why is the cost of living crushing the working class while the elite thrive? Why does the government feel like an enemy rather than a servant? The moderator's voice boomed through the speakers, introducing the candidates, but the words felt distant, drowned out by the psychic weight of the confrontation to come. Everyone knew that tonight the script was going to be burned. Gavin Newsom took his place behind the podium, gripping the edges with manicured hands, his posture radiating a practiced, almost arrogant relaxation. He scanned the room, locking eyes with friendly faces in the front row, his internal monologue likely a soothing loop of affirmation. He was the future, he was the electable one, he was the inevitable heir to the throne. To him, this debate was a formality, a mere box to check on the road to the White House. He had his lines memorized. He had his deflections prepared. He had his compassionate face ready to deploy at the first sign of trouble. But behind the veneer of the slick hair and the tailored suit, there was a disconnect, a fatal blindness to the anger simmering in the country. He saw voters as data points to be managed, not human beings to be heard. Conversely, Tulsi Gabbard stood motionless, her hands resting lightly on the lectern, her expression unreadable, void of the desperate need to be like that radiated from her opponent. She wasn't there to charm. She wasn't there to audition for a cabinet position. She was there to prosecute a case. Her internal landscape was calm, focused, a quiet storm gathering strength. She knew Newsom's record better than he knew it himself. She knew the hypocrisy, the failures, the broken promises that littered his path to power. She wasn't looking at the cameras. She was looking through them directly at the single mother in Ohio, the factory worker in Michigan, the struggling family in Sacramento. The crowd sensed this difference immediately. A murmur rippled through the hall, a low-frequency vibration of excitement. Phones were raised, screens glowing like fireflies in the dim auditorium, ready to capture the moment the facade cracked. There was no telling when the blow would land, but the anticipation was a physical ache in the room. The stage was set for a theater of war. One combatant armed with the shield of the establishment, polished to a blinding sheen but brittle underneath. The other armed with the spear of uncomfortable truth, sharpened by years of being ostracized for refusing to kneel. Before a single syllable was uttered, the tension was palpable, a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. This wasn't just politics. It was a reckoning. What transpired over the next 90 minutes would not only dominate the news cycle for weeks, but would leave every person watching with a singular, haunting question that lingered long after the lights went down. Is the era of the polished politician finally dead? The answer, brutal and swift, was waiting in the wings. The moderator, a veteran journalist with a furrowed brow, wasted no time with pleasantries. He looked down at his cards, then up at the governor, his voice slicing through the hushed room. Governor Newsom, let's begin with the issue that is top of mind for every American watching tonight: public safety. Under your leadership, California has seen a surge in violent crime, brazen smash-and-grab robberies, and a general sense of lawlessness that has terrified residents. Critics argue your policies have emboldened criminals. How do you justify your record to the families living in fear? Newsom leaned into the microphone, his smile dimming just enough to simulate concern, shifting seamlessly into his performance mode. "It is a fair question," he began, his voice smooth, modulating perfectly to sound authoritative yet empathetic. "But we have to look at the data, not the anecdotes. California is leading the way in reimagining what justice looks like. We are moving away from the failed mass incarceration models of the past and investing in community-based solutions, in mental health, in rehabilitation. We have increased funding for local law enforcement while simultaneously addressing the root causes of crime. It is a complex issue, and while there is always work to be doing, we are building a system that is more equitable and ultimately safer for everyone." The words floated through the air, beautifully constructed, rhythmically perfect, and utterly empty. A few polite, scattered applause broke out from the designated partisan sections, but the vast majority of the room remained silent, a heavy, skeptical silence. The people in the audience who had had their car windows smashed, who had watched their local drugstores lock up toothpaste behind plexiglass, who avoided walking downtown after sunset. They didn't hear a plan. They heard buzzwords. They heard a politician telling them not to believe their lying eyes. Tulsi Gabbard waited for the moderator to turn to her. She didn't jump in. She let Newsom's words hang there, festering in the quiet. When the light on her camera turned red, she didn't raise her voice. She lowered it. "Governor," she said, her tone conversational but laced with steel, "you talk about reimagining justice and root causes. But tell me, what root cause justifies a grandmother being beaten in broad daylight in San Francisco while her attacker is released within hours? What equity is there for the small business owner who immigrated to this country with nothing, built a life, and then watches it get looted while police stand by, handcuffed by your policies?" The crowd stirred, a collective intake of breath. This wasn't political jargon. This was the language of the street, the language of the dinner table. She continued, her eyes locking onto Newsom, who was already shifting his weight, his smile tightening at the corners. "You live behind gated walls, Governor. You have private security detail funded by the taxpayers. You don't feel the consequences of your reimagining. The people do. The mothers afraid to let their children play in the park do. You speak of data. The data says people are fleeing your state because they don't feel safe. That is not an anecdote. That is an indictment of your leadership." The applause began before she even finished the sentence. It wasn't the polite golf clap applause Newsom had received. It was a sharp, aggressive sound, a release of pent-up validation. Someone in the back shouted, "Tell him." The cameras swung to catch the reaction in the audience, heads nodding vigorously, faces set in grim agreement. Newsom's jaw clenched, a tiny, involuntary muscle spasm that betrayed his irritation. He had expected a policy debate on recidivism rates. He was getting hit with a moral accusation. He quickly tried to regain the floor, his voice pitching slightly higher, faster. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, fear-mongering doesn't solve problems. It's easy to cherry-pick tragic incidents to score political points. But governing is about making hard choices. We are tackling systemic racism in the justice system. We are ensuring that poverty isn't treated as a crime. We cannot simply arrest our way out of this." "But you can't ignore your way out of it either," Tulsi shot back instantly, cutting off his flow. The interruption was sharp, shocking the moderator into silence. "You call it fear-mongering, I call it listening. You say poverty isn't a crime, and I agree. But theft is a crime. Assault is a crime. Murder is a crime. And under your watch, the line between criminal behavior and acceptable behavior has been erased. You talk about hard choices. The hard choice is admitting that your experiment has failed, and that innocent people are paying the price for your ideology. The room erupted. A roar of approval swept from the back rows to the front, drowning out Newsom's attempt to interject. He stood there, mouth slightly open, hand raised in a futile gesture for silence. For the first time, the sheen of invincibility flickered. He looked toward the moderator, his eyes pleading for an intervention, for a return to the rules, to the script where he was the protagonist. But the moderator was looking at the crowd, realizing that the energy in the room had shifted irrevocably. The narrative was slipping from the governor's grasp like sand. The camera zoomed in on Newsom's hands gripping the podium. His knuckles were white. He took a sip of water, his eyes darting to his notes, searching for the pre-written line that would neutralize this attack. But there was nothing in his binder for opponent speaks raw truth to power. He realized with a sinking sensation in his gut that his standard playbook, pivot, deflect, smile, was useless against someone who refused to play the game. The moderator, sensing the need to regain control, cleared his throat loudly. "Let's move on," he said, though the audience was still buzzing, the adrenaline level in the room spiked. "Governor Newsom, we must discuss the economy. Inflation is battering American families. In your state, the cost of living is the highest in the continental United States. Gas prices, housing, groceries, everything is more expensive. You often tout California as an economic engine, but for the average worker, that engine seems to be running them over. What is your specific plan to lower costs right now?" Newsom seemed to visibly relax at the change of topic. The economy. He could handle the economy. He had numbers for this. He straightened his tie, reassembling his composure. "California is the 5th largest economy in the world," he proclaimed, his voice regaining some of its booming theatricality. "We are the home of innovation, of Silicon Valley, of the green energy revolution. Yes, global inflation is a challenge, but we have sent checks directly to taxpayers to help with relief. We have raised the minimum wage. We are fighting corporate greed that drives up prices at the pump. We are investing in affordable housing like never before. The California dream is alive and well because we are creating the jobs of the future, right here, right now." He finished with a flourish, a practiced hand gesture that invited applause, but the response was tepid, a smattering of claps that died out almost instantly. The disconnect was glaring. He was talking about global inflation and green energy to people who were deciding which meal to skip so they could pay the electric bill. Tulsi Gabbard stepped into the vacuum of silence he left behind. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need to. She looked directly at the camera, piercing the lens, speaking to the millions of exhausted citizens on the other side. "The governor talks about the 5th largest economy in the world like it's a trophy on his shelf," she said, her voice dropping to a register of quiet, simmering anger. "But you can't eat GDP. You can't live inside a stock market graph. When he says the California dream is alive, he's talking about the dream for his donors, for the tech giants, for the special interests that fund his campaigns, for the waitress working 2 shifts. The dream is a nightmare." She turned her body fully toward Newsom, confronting him physically as well as verbally. "You sent out relief checks. That was their own money you were giving back to them after taxing them into oblivion. You talk about fighting corporate greed, yet you shut down small businesses during the pandemic while allowing the big box stores, your donors, to stay open and make record profits. You didn't fight greed, Governor. You mandated it." A gasp went through the room. The accusation regarding the pandemic lockdowns was the third rail of politics, the wound that hadn't healed. Newsom stiffened, his eyes flashing with genuine anger now. This was personal. "That is a gross mischaracterization of history," Newsom snapped, abandoning the polite facade. "We made tough decisions to save lives based on science. We protected the vulnerable while you were on Fox News criticizing public health officials. I will not apologize for prioritizing the health of my constituents over political expediency." "You prioritize the health of your constituents," Tulsi countered, her voice rising in volume for the first time, cracking like a whip. Is that why you were dining at the French Laundry, unmasked, with lobbyists, while you ordered millions of Californians to stay locked in their homes? Is that why you kept your winery open while shutting down the family-owned restaurants down the street? The mention of the French Laundry hit the room like a physical blow. The hypocrisy of that moment was legendary, the symbol of the rules for the but not for me governance that had infuriated the nation. The audience didn't just clap, they hooted. They whistled. It was a visceral release of 2 years of suppressed rage. Newsom's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. The smile was gone entirely now. He looked trapped, a man caught in the spotlight of his own arrogance. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer the standard apology that wasn't an apology, but the sound of the crowd was overwhelming. They weren't letting him off the hook. Tulsi didn't let up. She rode the wave of the crowd's energy. Leadership is example, Governor. It is shared sacrifice. When you demand sacrifice from the people but refuse to bear it yourself, that isn't leadership. That is tyranny with a smile, and the people are done smiling back. The cheers were deafening now. The moderator was practically banging the table to restore order, but the dynamic of the debate had fundamentally altered. Newsom wasn't the inevitable leader anymore. He was the defendant. And the prosecutor was relentless. As the noise finally subsided, the camera caught a glimpse of Newsom's campaign manager in the wings, frantically typing on a phone, looking pale. The narrative was collapsing in real time. Newsom took a long drink of water, his hand trembling slightly. He needed a pivot. He needed to get back to safe ground. He needed to attack her character because he couldn't defend his own record. The moderator, looking slightly frazzled, moved to the next segment. Let's shift to the issue of homelessness. It is a humanitarian crisis visible in every major city in the West. Governor, despite billions in spending, the number of unhoused individuals continues to rise. Why is the strategy failing? Newsom saw an opening. He could blame the federal government. He could blame red states. He gathered himself, taking a deep breath, trying to summon the compassionate technocrat persona again. Homelessness is a national tragedy, he said, his voice grave. It is not just a California issue. We are dealing with mental health, addiction, and a housing shortage that has been decades in the making. I have committed more resources than any governor in history to this problem. We are buying hotels. We are building tiny homes. We are getting people off the streets and into care. But we cannot do it alone. We are fighting a tide of economic disparity that is bigger than one state. He was trying to sound reasonable, trying to sound like the adult in the room dealing with impossible odds. But the visual of the tents, the needles, the misery on the streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco was burned into the collective retina of the audience. His words sounded like excuses. Tulsi waited, her silence again acting as a weapon. When she spoke, it was with a tone of profound sadness that silenced the room. Governor, I've walked through those encampments. I've spoken to the veterans sleeping in their own filth on the streets of the state that has the most billionaires in the country. You talk about spending billions. Where did it go? You've created a homelessness industrial complex where consultants and nonprofits get rich, and the homeless stay on the street. She leaned forward, pinning him with her gaze. You don't solve homelessness because you've monetized it. If you actually solve the problem, the flow of money would stop. You claim it's complex. It isn't complex to clear the sidewalk so children can walk to school safely. It isn't complex to enforce the law against open drug use. It isn't complex to demand that if we offer shelter, it must be accepted. You lack the political will, because you are more beholden to the activists than you are to the citizens. Newsom exploded. That is cynical and it is wrong. We are treating people with dignity. You would criminalize poverty. You would sweep people away like trash. That is not the California way. There is no dignity in allowing a human being to slowly die of a fentanyl overdose on a public sidewalk while you step over them on your way to a fundraiser. Tulsi roared back, her voice echoing off the rafters. The raw power of her retort stunned the room. It was the moment the dam broke. There is no compassion in enabling self-destruction, she continued, her voice trembling with controlled fury. True compassion is intervention. True compassion is saying no more. You have abandoned the mentally ill to the mercy of the streets under the guise of rights, and it is a moral failure of the highest order. You are not the champion of the poor, Governor. You are the architect of their misery. The audience leaped to their feet. It wasn't just applause, it was a standing ovation in the middle of a debate segment. The moderator gave up trying to quiet them. The camera showed people wiping tears from their eyes, nodding fiercely. Finally, someone was saying it. Finally, someone was cutting through the layers of bureaucratic excuses and touching the raw nerve of the tragedy. Newsom looked small behind the podium. The California way, he touted, was being exposed as a dystopian failure, and he had no defense against the reality that everyone could see. He looked at his watch, praying for a commercial break, but there was no escape. The night was young, and Tulsi Gabbard was just getting started. The applause that had erupted following Tulsi's indictment of the homelessness industrial complex didn't just fade, it lingered in the air like smoke after a demolition. The silence that eventually followed was heavier than before, charged with a new, dangerous volatility. Gavin Newsom stood amidst the wreckage of his prepared talking points, his mind racing to find a foothold. The lights above him felt hotter now, searing into the layer of makeup that was beginning to sheen with perspiration. He adjusted his cuffs, a nervous tick that the high-definition cameras caught and broadcast to millions. Inside his head, the voice of his political consultant screamed for him to pivot, to attack, to drag the conversation back to the abstract ideals where he felt safe. He looked at Tulsi, expecting to see triumph, but he saw only that terrifying, placid resolve. She wasn't celebrating the blow she had just struck. She was already reloading. The moderator, sensing the fragility of the moment, shuffled his papers loudly, the sound amplified through the hall. He needed to steer the ship away from the rocks of total chaos. "We need to move on," he announced, his voice tight. "Governor, Congresswoman, let's address the issue of the southern border and immigration. Governor Newsom, California is a sanctuary state. You have famously extended state-funded health care to undocumented immigrants. Critics argue this incentivizes illegal crossings and strains resources meant for citizens. With border crossings at historic highs, how do you defend these policies to a taxpayer in Los Angeles who can't get an appointment at their own local clinic?" Newsom straightened up. This was his turf, the moral high ground. He believed firmly that his stance on immigration was the ultimate signifier of his benevolence, a shield against any accusation of failure. He stepped into the light, his face composing itself into a mask of righteous indignation. "I am proud that California is a state of refuge," Newsom declared, his voice regaining its resonant sermon-like quality. "We do not turn our backs on the most vulnerable. While others build walls and demonize families fleeing persecution, we build bridges. Diversity is not just a slogan for us. It is our economic and cultural superpower. The idea that we should deny basic human rights like healthcare to human beings simply because of a piece of paper is abhorrent to our values. We are showing the nation what compassion looks like in action. We are integrating these communities, not alienating them. That is the future." He gestured expansively, his eyes scanning the horizon of the auditorium, waiting for the applause that usually accompanied this speech at party conventions. But the room remained eerily quiet. There was a disconnect between the lofty rhetoric of bridges and the reality of the overwhelmed hospitals, the crowded schools, and the suppressed wages that the audience lived with daily. A few supporters clapped, but it sounded thin, almost apologetic. Tulsi Gabbard did not gesture. She did not preach. She leaned onto the podium, her body language shifting from prosecutor to protector. "Governor," she began, her voice low, vibrating with a grim intensity. "You use the word compassion like a shield, but there is nothing compassionate about your open border policies. Who benefits from the chaos you champion? It isn't the American family seeing their community overrun. And it certainly isn't the migrant dying of dehydration in the desert or being sold into sex slavery by the cartels." Paused, letting the word cartels hang in the air. "By signaling to the world that our borders are open, that benefits are free, you have effectively turned the United States government into the business partner of the Sinaloa cartel. You are funding their operations with the lives of the vulnerable. You claim to care about human rights, Yet you preside over a policy that has incentivized the greatest expansion of human trafficking in modern history. That isn't virtue, Governor. That is complicity. The charge hit the room like a thunderclap. Newsom recoiled, his eyes widening. He had expected an argument about budgets or taxes. He was being accused of aiding and abetting a criminal enterprise. "That is outrageous," he sputtered, breaking decorum, his voice cracking. "To suggest that—" "I'm not suggesting it, I am stating it," Tulsi cut him off, her voice slicing through his outrage like a cold blade. "You invite them in, but where do they go? They don't go to your gated community in Fair Oaks. They go to the working-class neighborhoods that are already struggling. You flood the labor market with low-wage workers, driving down the wages of the very unions you claim to support. You strain the schools of the poorest districts. You champion a sanctuary state because it makes you feel good at your cocktail parties, while the people you serve are left to deal with the consequences of a dissolved sovereignty." The camera panned to a man in the third row, wearing a faded union cap, his arms crossed, nodding slowly, his eyes locked on Tulsi. The connection was electric. She was articulating the betrayal of the working class that had been simmering for decades. Newsom tried to regain control, his face flushing. "This is dangerous, isolationist rhetoric," he shouted, pointing a finger at her. "We are a nation of immigrants, my ancestors. We are a nation of laws," Tulsi fired back, her voice suddenly booming, startling the front row. "Without a border, there is no nation. You have sacrificed the safety of your citizens on the altar of your own vanity. You want to be the president of the world, Governor, but your job is to be the governor of California, and you have failed to protect the very people who pay your salary." The audience erupted again, a mix of cheers and angry shouts. The veneer of the sanctuary narrative was cracking under the pressure of reality. Newsom looked frantic, his eyes darting to the moderator, silently demanding protection, but the moderator was busy scribbling notes, sensing that the script was dead. Newsom realized he was losing on the very issue he thought made him untouchable. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, a cold reminder that he was in uncharted territory. He was being outflanked not from the right, but from the ground up. The moderator, capitalizing on the high tension, pivoted sharply. "Let's move to education and parental rights," he announced, his voice cutting through the din. "Governor Newsom, your administration has clashed repeatedly with local school boards and parents over curriculum, specifically regarding gender identity and what information is shared with parents. You've labeled some of these parental groups as extremists. Do you believe the state has a higher authority over children than their own parents?" Newsom saw this as his chance to rally the base. This was the culture war. He knew the lines. He smoothed his tie, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is about protecting kids," he said, his tone dropping to a whispery, conspiratorial intimacy. "We have to create safe spaces for all children, especially LGBTQ youth who are under attack across this country. When parents, or rather, radicalized political groups posing as parents, try to ban books, try to erase history, try to out children before they are ready, the state has a moral obligation to intervene. We are standing up against hate. We are standing up for inclusion. I will always side with the child against intolerance." He leaned back, satisfied. He had used all the right buzzwords: safe spaces, inclusion, intolerance. He felt he had cornered her. If she opposed him, she was a bigot. It was a trap he had set 100 times. Tulsi Gabbard looked at him with a mixture of pity and disbelief. She waited for the applause from his corner to die down, which it did, quickly, swallowed by the skeptical silence of the majority. "Governor," she said softly, "you just called parents political groups. You just implied that mothers and fathers concerned about their children's education are agents of hate. Do you hear yourself?" She stepped out from behind the podium, breaking the barrier, moving closer to the audience. "The bond between a parent and a child is sacred. It pre-exists the state. It transcends the government. When you pass laws that allow schools to hide a child's mental health crisis or gender transition from their own parents, you are not protecting the child. You are driving a wedge between them and the only people who will love them unconditionally." Newsom opened his mouth to interrupt, but Tulsi held up a hand, silencing him with a look. You speak of safe spaces, but you have made schools a battleground. You have stripped parents of their rights and then demonized them when they show up to school board meetings to ask questions. You call them extremists. These are the people who pack the lunches, who drive the carpools, who stay up all night when their kids are sick. They are not the enemy, Governor. They are the primary stakeholders. And the arrogance of believing that you, a politician in Sacramento, know better how to raise their children than they do is exactly why families are packing U-Hauls and leaving your state in droves. That is a distortion, Newsom barked, his composure fracturing. We are protecting privacy, we are. You are usurping authority. Tulsi's voice rang out, clear and uncompromising. You are trying to replace the family with the state, and that is not inclusion. That is totalitarianism dressed up in a rainbow flag. Parents don't want the government co-parenting their children. They want you to teach them to read, write, and do math, subjects where, by the way, California's proficiency scores have plummeted under your watch. You focus on indoctrination because you have failed at education. The reaction was visceral. The crowd didn't just cheer, they roared. It was a release of the frustration of every parent who had felt silenced, every mother who had been told she didn't have a say. The camera caught a woman in the audience wiping tears from her face, nodding violently. Newsom looked around, bewildered. He had framed this as a civil rights issue, but Tulsi had successfully reframed it as a human rights issue, the right of the family to exist without government interference. Newsom looked at his notes, his hands shaking slightly. He saw the polling data in his head. Suburban women were supposed to be his stronghold. But as he looked out at the faces in the hall, he saw those very women looking at him with cold, hard eyes. He was losing the center. He was losing the narrative. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of panic. He was the golden boy, the one who never lost, the one who could charm his way out of anything. But charm didn't work when the lights were this bright, and the truth was this stark. Let us be clear, Newsom stammered, trying to pivot back to his strength. I believe in the rights of parents, but not at the expense of. At the expense of what? Tulsi snapped, not letting him breathe. At the expense of your ideology. You mandate vaccines for children but exempt the teachers' unions who fund your campaign. You close playgrounds but keep the strip clubs open. You tell parents they are dangerous while you release violent felons into their neighborhoods. The hypocrisy is so thick, Governor, it's suffocating. You don't trust the people, and that is why the people no longer trust you. The round ended with Newsom drinking frantically from his water glass, his face pale under the stage lights. The momentum was entirely with Gabbard. She was methodical, dismantling him piece by piece, first his record on crime, then the economy, then the border, and now the sacred bond of the family. She wasn't just debating a candidate. She was deconstructing a worldview. The moderator, looking exhausted, checked the time. We have time for one more major topic before closing statements, he said. Energy and the environment. Governor Newsom, you have positioned yourself as a global climate leader. You've mandated a shift to electric vehicles and banned gas appliances. Yet, California faces rolling blackouts, and you import oil from foreign adversaries to keep the lights on. How do you square your green goals with the reality of an energy grid that is teetering on the brink of collapse? Newsom took a deep breath. This was it. Climate change, the existential threat. This was where he could paint her as a denier, a Luddite. He summoned every ounce of his remaining charisma. The climate crisis is not a future threat. It is happening now, he intoned, his voice grave. California is burning. The world is burning. We have a moral obligation to transition away from fossil fuels. Yes, the transition is hard. Yes, there are bumps in the road. But we are leading the world. We are creating a green economy that will be the envy of nations. My opponent wants to drag us back to the age of coal and oil, to ignore the science, to doom our children to a planet that is uninhabitable. I choose to fight for their future. He looked at the camera, his eyes misty with practiced concern. It was a good performance. It was emotional. It was urgent. Tulsi Gabbard stood silently for a moment, letting his words settle. Then, a small, knowing smile touched her lips. It was the smile of someone who holds the checkmate card. Governor, she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. If you care so much about the planet, why did you shut down Diablo Canyon, the source of clean, carbon-free nuclear energy that powered millions of homes, only to replace it with diesel generators when the grid failed? You talk about science, but you ignore the physics of energy density. She took a step forward. You ban gas cars in California, but where do you think the electricity comes from to charge the EVs? It comes from the grid you destabilized. And the batteries, they are mined by child slaves in the Congo, in conditions that are a crime against humanity. You outsource the pollution and the suffering to the third world so you can drive a Tesla and feel virtuous. That isn't environmentalism. That is colonialism with a green sticker. The silence in the hall was absolute. She had stripped the moral veneer off his flagship issue. You force working families to pay the highest gas prices in the nation, she continued, punishing them for driving to the jobs they need to survive, while you fly on private jets to climate summits in Europe. You lecture us about our carbon footprint while yours is the size of a small town. The people of California aren't against clean air. They are against the luxury beliefs of a ruling class that demands sacrifice from everyone but themselves. Newsom looked like he had been slapped. The private jet line landed with a thud. It was the ultimate symbol of the elite disconnect, and she had pinned it directly to his lapel. He opened his mouth to retort, to talk about carbon offsets, but he knew deep down that the argument was lost. He looked at the audience and saw not admiration, but a dawning realization. They were seeing the man behind the curtain, and he was smaller, pettier, and far more ordinary than the giant projected on the screen. The debate was no longer a contest of ideas. It was a public unmasking. And as the moderator prepared to signal the final segment, the atmosphere in the room felt less like a political event and more like the end of an era. The invincible governor was bleeding out on live television, and Tulsi Gabbard was standing over him, holding the scalpel of truth, ready to deliver the final cut. The moderator, now sweating visibly under the glare of the studio lights, shuffled his papers with a trembling hand. The energy in the room had shifted from a simmer to a boil, and the carefully constructed guardrails of the debate were buckling under the weight of the confrontation. He cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly as he introduced the next topic, one that would strike at the very heart of the establishment's power structure. "Governor Newsom, Congresswoman Gabbard," he began, trying to regain a semblance of authority. "Let's turn to foreign policy and national security. We are living in a time of global instability, conflicts in Europe, rising tensions in the Pacific, and chaos in the Middle East. Governor Newsom, you have fully supported the current administration's approach of sending billions in aid and weaponry to foreign conflicts, stating that defending democracy abroad is vital to our interests. Meanwhile, here at home, our infrastructure is crumbling. How do you explain to a family in Oakland, whose school is falling apart, that we can afford another $100 billion for a war halfway across the world, but we can't afford to fix their neighborhood?" Newsom straightened his spine, sensing an opportunity to look presidential. This was the realm of statesmen, of serious people. He adjusted his suit jacket, summoning the gravitas he had practiced in front of mirrors for decades. "This is a fundamental misunderstanding of America's role in the world," Newsom declared, his voice deepening into a baritone of solemn authority. "We are the indispensable nation. When democracy is under attack anywhere, it is under attack everywhere. If we retreat, if we turn inward, we embolden dictators and tyrants. Yes, we have needs at home and we are addressing them, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. The investment in global stability is an investment in our own security. Isolationism is not a strategy. It is a surrender. We must stand with our allies, or we will find ourselves standing alone in a dangerous world." He paused for effect, expecting the nod of approval that usually came from the foreign policy establishment. He felt he had struck the right chord, patriotic, expansive, firm. He was channeling the ghosts of past presidents, wrapping himself in the flag. Tulsi Gabbard stood motionless, her eyes fixed on him with a chilling, predatory focus. She waited until the last echo of his voice faded, leaving a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with the coming storm. "Governor," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to the furthest corners of the room, "you talk about walking and chewing gum, but tell that to the people of Maui. Tell that to the people of East Palestine. While you and your party were sending billions to protect the borders of a foreign nation, our own citizens were begging for water, for shelter, for basic dignity, and they were told the cupboard was dry. The mention of Maui sent a shockwave through the audience. It was a raw wound, a symbol of total government abandonment. You speak of defending democracy, Tulsi continued, stepping closer to her microphone, her intensity ratcheting up. But what is democratic about funding proxy wars that we didn't vote for? What is democratic about stripping our own treasury to line the pockets of the military-industrial complex while our veterans sleep under bridges in San Diego? You aren't defending democracy, Governor. You are laundering money for the war machine. Newsom bristled, his face tightening. That is a dangerous conspiracy theory, he snapped, his composure slipping again. We are standing up to aggression. We are protecting the free world. Your rhetoric sounds like it was written by our adversaries. This is about values. Values? Tulsi shot back, her voice suddenly sharp as a whip. Is it your value to send the sons and daughters of the working class to die in conflicts that have no clear objective, just so defense contractors can hit their quarterly earnings targets? You sit in your ivory tower, safe and secure, while the families of this country bear the cost in blood and bone. You treat war like a board game. I have worn the uniform. I have seen the cost of war. And I tell you, there is nothing indispensable about bankrupting our nation to police the world. The applause that erupted was different this time. It wasn't just agreement. It was a guttural roar of validation. The anti-war sentiment, long suppressed by the mainstream narrative, had found its voice. People in the audience were standing, pointing, shouting, yes. The camera caught a young man in a wheelchair, a veteran nodding fiercely, tears streaming down his face. Newsom looked rattled. He tried to interrupt, to shout about alliances and obligations, but his words were drowned out by the sheer volume of the crowd's reaction. He was losing the moral high ground on the one issue he thought was unassailable. He looked small, a bureaucrat reciting a pamphlet while facing a warrior who spoke from the soul. The moderator, seeing the governor floundering, quickly tried to pivot. Please, let's have order, he pleaded, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. We must address another critical issue, civil liberties and the First Amendment. Governor Newsom, your administration has been aggressive in combating what you call misinformation, specifically regarding health mandates and election integrity. You signed legislation that pressures social media companies to remove content deemed harmful. Critics call this state-sponsored censorship. Where do you draw the line between public safety and free speech? Newsom took a breath, trying to reset. He believed in this. He truly believed that the unwashed masses couldn't be trusted with unfiltered information. He leaned forward, adopting a tone of condescending patience, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow child. Free speech is not absolute, Newsom stated, his hands clasped on the podium. You cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. We are living in an era of information warfare. Lies cost lives. We saw it during the pandemic. We see it with hate speech online. The government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from dangerous falsehoods that incite violence or undermine public health. This isn't censorship. It's responsible governance. We are asking tech companies to be accountable, to stop the spread of toxic algorithms that radicalize our youth. If that makes me a villain to the conspiracy theorists, so be it. He lifted his chin, defiant. He felt he was on solid ground here. The experts agreed with him. The editorial boards agreed with him. Surely, the people wanted to be protected from disinformation. Tulsi Gabbard let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a sound that cut through the tension, disarming and devastating. Governor, she said, shaking her head slightly. The fire in a crowded theater argument. That was used to imprison anti-war activists in World War I. It was overturned by the Supreme Court decades ago. The fact that you are still using it shows just how little you understand or care about the Constitution. She turned to the audience, her expression hardening. He talks about dangerous falsehoods. But who gets to decide what is false? Him, his donors, the unelected bureaucrats in Washington. Governor, you labeled the lab leak theory as disinformation and censored it until it turned out to be the most likely origin. You labeled the hunter's laptop as Russian disinformation and censored it until it was proven true. You didn't protect the public from lies. You protected the establishment from the truth. The crowd gasped. She was listing the taboos, the forbidden topics, one by one. You call it responsible governance, Tulsi pressed on, her voice rising. I call it the Ministry of Truth. When the government coerces private companies to silence dissent, that is a direct violation of the First Amendment. You are afraid of free speech because you are afraid of the people. You know that if they are allowed to speak freely, if they are allowed to question your narratives, your grip on power crumbles. You aren't fighting hate speech, Governor. You are fighting anything that threatens your control. Newsom's face turned a mottled purple. That is absurd, he yelled, leaning over the podium. We are protecting democracy from mob rule. We are protecting the institutions that hold this country together. You are inviting chaos. The First Amendment is the institution, Tulsi roared back, stepping out from behind her podium again, commanding the stage. It is the bedrock of everything. Without it, we are not citizens, we are subjects. And looking at your record, Governor, that seems to be exactly what you want. Subjects who obey, who don't question, and who thank you for the privilege of being silenced. The room exploded. It was a chaotic, beautiful noise. The audience sensed the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just a debate about policy. It was a debate about the soul of the country. Freedom versus control. The individual versus the state. And Newsom, the avatar of the state, was being stripped naked. Newsom looked around the hall, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He realized that the mob he despised was in the room with him, and they weren't listening to his orders anymore. He tried to smile, to do the polished, winning grin, but his facial muscles wouldn't cooperate. It came out as a grimace, a rictus of fear. The moderator, now visibly shaking, tried to regain control. "Congresswoman, please." "Governor." "No," Tulsi said, holding the floor. "Let him answer." "Governor, you signed a bill that allows the state to take custody of children if parents don't affirm their gender identity. You signed bills to track the financial transactions of gun owners. You set up a hotline for neighbors to report each other for intolerance. This isn't the behavior of a democratic leader. This is the behavior of a dictator in waiting." Newsom slammed his hand on the podium. "I am protecting the vulnerable," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I am on the right side of history." "You are on the side of power," Tulsi replied, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "And history has a very harsh way of judging those who choose power over freedom." The silence that followed was absolute. Newsom stood panting, his hair slightly askew, his tie crooked. The perfect image was gone. In its place was a man unraveling. He looked at the camera, desperate for a lifeline, but the red light stared back like an unblinking eye, recording every second of his collapse. The moderator, realizing that the debate had effectively turned into a rout, tried to salvage the timeline. We have to move to the next segment," he stammered. "The issue of trust in institutions. Governor Newsom, poll after poll shows that trust in government, media, and science is at an all-time low. You often speak of the importance of trusting the experts. But when the experts have been wrong, about the economy, about the pandemic, about the border, why should the American people continue to follow blindly?" Newsom wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He needed to be the victim now. He needed to be the martyr for rationality. "We are living in a cynicism crisis," Newsom said, his voice trembling slightly. "There is a concerted effort by right-wing media and bad actors to undermine faith in our institutions. Yes, science evolves. Yes, mistakes are made. But the alternative is chaos. The alternative is listening to podcasters instead of doctors. We have to rebuild trust by doubling down on facts, by supporting our institutions, not tearing them down. The people need guidance. They need steady hands." "The people don't need guidance, Governor," Tulsi interjected, her voice devoid of mockery now, filled only with a stern resolve. "They need the truth. And the reason they don't trust you is because you have lied to them repeatedly. You lied about the efficacy of the mandates. You lied about the safety of the streets. You lied about the budget deficit in your own state, claiming a surplus right before announcing a $30 billion hole. Trust isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. And you have spent every ounce of your political capital burning it to the ground." She paused, looking directly at the voters at home. They call us conspiracy theorists for asking questions. They call us extremists for wanting to know where our money is going. But the real extremism is a government that operates in the shadows, that weaponizes agencies against its political opponents, and that treats the truth as a classified secret. The system isn't broken, Governor. It's fixed, and the people are waking up to the game. Newsom stood frozen. The accusation of the fixed system was the one thing he couldn't refute because he was the product of that system. He was the chosen one, groomed by the Getty family, elevated by the machine, protected by the media. And now, for the first time, he was facing someone who didn't care about the machine. The audience began to chant. It started low in the back, a rumble. Tell the truth, tell the truth. It grew louder, spreading through the hall. The moderator looked helpless. Newsom looked terrified. Tulsi stood in the center of the storm, calm, anchored, the only person in the room who seemed to understand exactly what was happening. The debate was over. The trial had begun. The chant of "tell the truth" gradually subsided, not because the audience's anger had dissipated, but because the anticipation of the next clash was too potent to drown out with noise. The air in the room was electric, the kind of heavy, static charge that precedes a lightning strike. Gavin Newsom stood at his podium, checking his watch for the third time, a subtle gesture of a man looking for an exit door that didn't exist. He had come here to be crowned the leader of the opposition. Instead, he was being dissected on live television. The moderator, wiping a bead of sweat from his upper lip, looked down at his cue cards. He knew the next question was dangerous. It touched on the very thing Newsom had been denying for months, the open secret that everyone in Washington, and clearly everyone in this room, already knew. Governor Newsom, the moderator began, his voice steadier now, sensing the gravity of the moment. You have repeatedly denied that you are running for president, yet you have debated red state governors, launched political action committees, and traveled internationally to meet with world leaders. Meanwhile, back in California, your approval ratings are hitting record lows. Critics say you are treating your governorship as a stepping stone, prioritizing your national ambition over the day-to-day struggles of your own constituents. How do you respond to the charge that you have checked out of California to focus on the White House? Newsom flashed a smile that was all teeth, a reflex of pure muscle memory. That is simply not true, he said, smoothing his tie, adopting the posture of the misunderstood statesman. I'm out there fighting for the values that California represents. We are under attack, our rights, our freedoms, our democracy. I cannot sit idly by while the extreme right rolls back progress across this nation. I travel to share the California success story, to build coalitions, to show that there is a better way. My focus is, and always has been, on the people of my state, but we cannot ignore the national landscape. Leadership requires multitasking. It was a smooth answer, polished by focus groups, success story, coalitions, multitasking. But in the context of the night's previous beatings, the words rang hollow. The audience shifted in their seats. They didn't want a multitasker. They wanted a governor who fixed the potholes. Tulsi Gabbard didn't rush. She let his answer hang there, smelling of expensive cologne and insincerity. When she finally spoke, her voice was deceptively gentle, almost sympathetic, which made the impact of her words even more devastating. Governor, she said, you call it multitasking. The people call it abandonment. You say you are sharing the California success story. Which part of the story are you sharing? The part where you have the highest poverty rate in the nation when adjusted for cost of living. The part where you have a $68 billion deficit after inheriting a surplus. Or the part where you lost a congressional seat because so many people fled your state that the population actually shrank for the first time in history. She took a step closer to the center of the stage, effectively turning her back on the moderator to address Newsom directly. You aren't running for president to save the country, Gavin. You're running to escape your own record. You're trying to fail up. You treat the governorship like a waiting room and the citizens of California like inconveniences that get in the way of your photo ops. That isn't leadership. That is narcissism. The crowd gasped. The word narcissism hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. It was the diagnosis everyone had whispered but no one had dared to say to his face. Newsom's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, the mask of congeniality finally dropping completely. "That is a personal attack," he snapped, his voice tight with genuine offense. "And it is beneath the dignity of this stage. I have dedicated my life to public service. I have led through fires, through pandemics, through economic crises. To dismiss that work as vanity is insulting to the thousands of people I work with every day." "The insult," Tulsi countered instantly, her voice rising to meet his anger, "is telling a family living in their car in San Diego that their governor is fighting for democracy in a television studio in New York. The insult is running ads in Florida while your own cities are drowning in crime. You talk about dignity. There is no dignity in using public office as a vanity project. If you want to run for president, have the courage to resign and run. But stop holding the people of California hostage to your ego." The applause was like a whip crack, sharp, sudden, and brutal. The audience was no longer just watching a debate, they were witnessing a prosecution. Newsom looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a friendly gaze but finding only judgment. He realized with a cold, sinking feeling that his national profile was actually a liability. He wasn't the savior of the party. He was the symbol of everything people hated about modern politics: the ambition, the detachment, the phoniness. The moderator, seeing Newsom struggling to regain his footing, decided to pivot to the final thematic pillar of the night, the question of the system. "Congresswoman Gabbard," the moderator said, turning to her, "you have built your brand as an outsider, a maverick who challenges the deep state and the military-industrial complex. Governor Newsom, on the other hand, is seen as a consummate insider, a man who knows how to work the levers of power within the establishment. The question for both of you is this: in today's fractured political environment, what is the most effective way to govern? Is it disruption, or is it cooperation?" Newsom jumped in before Tulsi could answer, desperate to reclaim the narrative. He needed to be the adult in the room again. "Governing is about getting things done," Newsom said, his voice urgent, pleading. "You can't govern by burning down the house. You need relationships. You need to work with Congress, with agencies, with the private sector. Tulsi talks a good game about the deep state, but that's just rhetoric. It's paranoia. Real leadership is about pragmatism. It's about compromise. It's about understanding how the system works so you can make it work for people. Being a lone wolf might get you likes on social media, but it doesn't get bills passed." He leaned over the podium, trying to project strength. "I know how to pick up the phone and get the president on the line. I know how to bring stakeholders to the table. That is what a governor does. We don't scream at the machine, we fix it." It was the classic defense of the establishment. "We know best. We have the connections." Tulsi waited, her expression impassive. She looked at Newsom, then at the audience, then back at him. "Governor," she said, her voice dropping to a low, powerful register, "the system you are so proud of knowing how to work, that system is the reason the middle class is dying. That system is the reason we are $34 trillion in debt. That system is the reason we are on the verge of World War III. You talk about cooperation. You are cooperating with the pharmaceutical companies to keep drug prices high. You are cooperating with the censorship complex to silence dissent. You are cooperating with the war machine to keep the blood money flowing." She paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. "You say I'm a lone wolf. I would rather stand alone and tell the truth than stand with a pack of wolves who are devouring the flock. You claim to fix the machine. Gavin, you are the machine. You are the polished hood ornament on a broken engine that is driving this country off a cliff. And the people don't want you to fix it. They want to shut it down." The room erupted. It was a visceral reaction. The audience stood up, not just clapping, but shouting. The phrase, "you are the machine," resonated perfectly. It encapsulated everything they felt about him: the slickness, the robotic talking points, the sense that he was a product rather than a person. Newsom looked stunned. He tried to laugh it off, to shake his head in dismissal, but the laughter died in his throat. He looked weak. He looked exposed. For the first time in his career, the insider status was not an asset. It was an albatross around his neck. That is simplistic populism," Newsom shouted over the noise, his voice shrill. You can't just tear everything down. Who is going to rebuild it? You. With what army? The American people, Tulsi replied, her voice cutting through the din like a bell. The army of mothers and fathers who are tired of being lied to. The workers who are tired of being sold out. The veterans who are tired of being used. You underestimate them, Governor. You think they need you to rule them, but they are realizing they don't need you at all. The camera zoomed in on Newsom's face. The arrogance was gone. In its place was fear. Not the fear of losing a debate, but the fear of irrelevance. He was watching the ground shift beneath his feet, the old rules of politics dissolving in real time. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, and he was realizing that his knife was made of plastic. The moderator tapped his gavel, but it was a feeble sound against the roar of the crowd. The debate had transcended the questions. It was now a contrast of essences. Authenticity versus artifice. Courage versus careerism. We are almost out of time, the moderator stammered, looking at the producer off camera who was signaling frantically. We have one final question before closing statements, a question of character. He looked at both candidates. Governor, Congresswoman, if you could ask the American people for forgiveness for one thing, one mistake, one failure, what would it be? It was a trap question. For a politician like Newsom, admitting fault was anathema. Newsom hesitated. His eyes darted. He couldn't admit the French Laundry. He couldn't admit the deficit. He couldn't admit the crime wave. He reverted to the safest possible answer. I think, Newsom began haltingly, I think sometimes I care too much. Sometimes I push too hard. I want to solve every problem overnight, and perhaps I haven't communicated my victories well enough. My failure is that I haven't told the story of our success clearly enough for everyone to understand. A groan went through the hall. It was the classic humble brag. I work too hard, I'm too good. It was insulting. Tulsi stepped forward. She didn't hesitate. I ask for forgiveness, she said, her voice clear and humble, for the times I trusted the system, for the times early in my career when I believed that the people in power had our best interests at heart. I was wrong. I learned the hard way that the only way to save this country is to stop trusting the establishment and start trusting the people. And I am here tonight to ask you to forgive me for not fighting harder sooner. The contrast was blinding. Newsom's apology was a defense of his ego. Tulsi's was an admission of a shared reality. The crowd felt it in their bones. One was a politician trying to survive the night. The other was a leader trying to save the future. As the segment ended, Newsom slumped against his podium, physically drained. He looked like a man who had gone 12 rounds with a heavyweight champion. His hair was slightly messed, his tie loosened. He looked human finally, but only in defeat. Tulsi stood tall, energized, her eyes bright. She hadn't just won the debate, she had broken the spell. The inevitable Gavin Newsom was inevitable no more.